Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the public square. This is, I hope you can hear me, this is the first version of our new series, which used to be held in the pub, but for a variety of reasons, we're now going online. And we hope this will be a series, the first in a series of continuing events that you might be interested in, which will be held once a month or so. My name is Mark Beeson, and in conjunction with another number of other colleagues, we've relaunched the Public Square, and you can find more information about us and what we're doing and future events on the Public Square website, which hopefully you've been sent information about. So tonight's event is going to be about the all-important relationship between China and Australia, which certainly in Australia, and possibly to a lesser extent in China, has been generating huge interest and discussion. And I think there isn't a more important public policy, foreign policy issue, certainly in Australia and to some extent in China too, around at the moment. So I think it's timely and important and very fortunate that we're going to have two very high profile and distinguished speakers to kick off our new series. So let me introduce them. The first is Professor Chen Hong, who is the Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Studies Centre, the Director of the Australian Studies Centre, and Head of Department of English and Department of Translation and Interpreting at East China Normal University in Shanghai. And in addition to all of the above, Hong's also a prolific commentator on foreign policy generally and our foreign policy in particular. And I urge you all to read some of his writing in the Global Times, because it will give you a sense of where some important aspects of the debate are actually in China at the moment. Likewise, our second equally distinguished speaker is Professor Ian Hall of Griffith University. Ian is a prolific author on the Indo-Pacific, Australian foreign policy, and has some very interesting views about our relationship with China as well. Ian is also the editor of the Australian Journal of International Affairs, which has published some very valuable analyses of this particular issue as well. So before I ask either of them to speak, can I just point out that for those of you who would like to join in this discussion, unfortunately you won't be able to do it live because this is a webinar broadcast and only the discussants will appear on your screens, but you are certainly able and encouraged to take part by sending in questions, comments, observations, which I will pass on to the two speakers in the Q&A session. So we're going to ask the speakers to talk for about 10 minutes or so, just to make some introductory remarks about the relationship, where they think it's going and what might be done about it, perhaps. And then we'll open it up to a wider discussion. So we're encouraging you to send in questions, and you do that by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and that will allow you to send in questions, and I'll try and pull out some of the most popular issues and present them to our two speakers for their consideration. So that's basically how it's going to work. So I'm going to ask Hong to start us off first. And as I say, both speakers will talk for about 10 minutes or so. Then they might want to respond to each other's positions, perhaps briefly. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. So without further ado, let me hand over to Hong and see what he's got to say from a Chinese perspective. Thanks very much, Hong.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for organizing this very important and, as you said, timely webinar, which I think actually, because China-Australia relations is indeed undergoing a critical period of time. And we do think that things must be ratified so that, the mutual understanding and better understanding will translate into a clearer picture about each other's, intentions, and also each other's, strategies for future. During their recent rows, over China's, imposition of anti-dumping tariffs on Australian barley and suspension of beef imports, from 4 Australian up to us. Australia starts to remind China that the two countries are comprehensive strategic partners. Scott Morrison, obviously Australia's Prime Minister, obviously did not have, I think, the partnership in his mind when he started to campaign for an international inquest of China's alleged responsibility for the COVID-19 outbreak. This is regarded as a kind of surprise attack initiated by the Morrison administration without any diplomacy and consultation in advance with Beijing in the spirit of partnership. And the so-called independent inquiry was basically for the manifest purpose to inculpate and incriminate China in support of Donald Trump's smear campaign to blame China so as to divert national and international attention and shirk Donald Trump's responsibility of mishandling the pandemic outbreak in the United States. And also Canberra also openly echoed Washington's rhetoric to support Taiwan to join the WHO, which is an international organization for sovereign states only. And this act is in flagrant violation of the One China policy, which is the cornerstone of the diplomatic relations between China and Australia. And we must ask, are all these the proper way for Australia to treat its comprehensive strategic partner? China's decisions about Australian barley and beef are not related to the deteriorating political and diplomatic relations. However, although they are by no means retaliatory in nature, it should be remembered that for steel pipes imported from China, Australia has imposed an anti-dumping tariff as high as 144%. Nowadays, Canberra seems to be regarding China through a lens that is sinisterly dark. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, Australia instantly readjusted the threshold of the Foreign Investment Review Board's examination for overseas proposals to $0, nil, on the fantasized grounds that China will take advantage of Australia's economic difficulties, I quote, to snap up strategically important assets in Australia. Although Australia achieved a record high of exports to China in 2019, and Chinese students and tourists have been contributing enormously to Australia's financial revenue, Australian political figures and media outlets have been incessantly urging for the necessity of decoupling with China, exaggerating about the so-called overdependence on the Chinese markets, and advocating to diversify trade partners and sources of tourists and students. In other words, it is Australia that has been making threats and promoting this idea of stopping the mutually beneficial economic trade and investment exchanges with China. For over 3 years, Canberra has been tirelessly censuring Beijing of incredible ominous misdemeanors that it claims to be threatening the security and sovereignty of Australia. When Australia sent its frigate HMS Parramatta to exercise with the US Navy at the South China Sea, does it ever cross Canberra's mind that it is taking threatening approaches that are interpreted in Beijing as jeopardizing China's sovereignty? So in other words, when Australia takes its numerous hostile initiatives to vehemently attack China and make offensive remarks on China's domestic and international policies, it claims to be exercising its independence. But when China in turn makes statements to justify itself, Australia accuses China of acting assertively, aggressively, like wolf warriors. This is, I think, fair dinkum unfair. There has indeed been increasing frustration here in China over Australia's unremitting demonstration of hostility. Australia has not acted as a comprehensive strategic partner, but rather as taking trade and economic advantages from the relationship while relentlessly and groundlessly attacking Beijing in collaboration with Washington's strategy to deter, contain, and suppress China's development as a way to maintain its hegemony and prevent China from overtaking its position. It is in fact the bilateral relationship that is becoming increasingly toxic thanks to Canberra's unyielding efforts. This is bound to affect a positive and conducive climate, which is indispensable for proactive trade and cultural exchanges that have been the keystone of our relationship. That's sorrow-free is at the lowest ever ebb, which is detrimental to the interest of both countries. And Canberra's serious, reckless steps to pick fights with China reveals a lack of strategic and sensible perception of the international reality by needlessly hijacking itself onto the anti-China campaign led by the United States. Australia puts its own interests at stake. It is always easier to break than make a relationship. The China-Australia relationship has been undergoing a downward spiral, and it has to be stopped. Canberra needs to be sensible and constructive and work in conjunction with China to steer the bilateral relationship back to its right track. The COVID-19 pandemic calls for global collaboration to combat the disease. What we need to fight is against the coronavirus, not each other. Cooperativeness needs to prevail over divisiveness and collaboration over confrontation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Hong. That was great and very interesting and very provocative start. And that will, I'm sure, generate a lot of questions. Now, speaking of which, we don't seem to have got any questions at all so far. So I don't know if you're all aware that you can submit questions as we're conducting this seminar by using your Q&A button. Using your chat button, I think it is. Am I right in saying that, Ash? The chat button, I think, at the bottom
it's
of
the
the
Q&A button, Mark.
Q&A button. Okay,
Yeah.
Sorry about that. A few technical hitches, everybody. So use the Q&A button to submit questions, and I'll pass them on to both the speakers at the end. So please do let us know what you're thinking about this, and if you have any questions you'd like answering, please use the Q&A button to send them in. Okay, so that's got us off to a very lively start. Thanks very much, Hong. So I might now pass over to the Australian side of the debate in some respects, to Ian Hall in Brisbane. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks very much for the invitation to be involved in this. It's great to be with you. It's kind of inky black out here in Brisbane, but I think, yeah, this is going to be quite a lively discussion. I think it's worth remembering things aren't fantastic at the moment in the bilateral relationship, but we have been in bad places before. If we think back to 2009, for example, despite the fact that we had our Mandarin-speaking Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, in charge, despite the fact that he'd made a very important visit up to Beijing, and where he'd spoken in Mandarin, and he'd spoken very frankly about the relationship, we still saw in 2009 the relationship deteriorate quite significantly. So Rio Tinto, of course, got wrapped up in the Stern Hu affair, which we saw an employee of theirs arrested, charged with espionage. We saw Rabia Kadir, the Uyghur visa incident in which Australia was willing to give a visa to Rabia Kadir to come to Australia and to speak in Australia. And then, of course, we also saw a defense white paper that talked about China in a very different way to the ones that had done before. And that, Beijing complained at the time that we talked about China in a language that Australia had really never talked about in the past, and had never really given an indication that it was going to talk about. Now, that period, 2008-9, was a tricky one. It was the global financial crisis, but it was also the point at which China started to assert itself in ways that it hadn't done in the past. That we can look back at that point and start to see much stronger positions being taken, for example, in the South China Sea. Okay, so we've been in bad positions before, but that things have changed in the interim, in the decade or so since, and it's worth exploring what those changes are, because I think it helps us to sort of answer some of the question you posed us about, well, what are we going to do about all of this? Well, let me ask, so what's changed? One of the most common answers is to say, well, China has just become significantly more powerful. And as it's become more powerful, it's been able to assert itself and to make stronger claims over its interests and to redefine its interests. And sometimes the claim is made that China is just acting as any other major power would in those circumstances. And there's something to that argument, but I don't think it's the entire explanation for what's going on here. The other things that we need to look at are the changing nature of the relationship itself, the way in which we are kind of entangled. And we've also got to look at the way in which Beijing's behavior has shifted over that period of time. So let's look at the entanglement. We often think about trade. And trade over that period of time has doubled. So 2010 was about $100 billion or so of bilateral trade. It's now about $200 billion. So it's doubled just in crude dollar terms. We've also seen the Chinese Australian population double of Australia in that period of time. And it's changed its character as well. So in the past, we had a population, some of whom have been here for a very long period of time, many Australian-born Chinese. We had many Hong Kong Chinese who had come in the past, and I'm in Brisbane here, and Brisbane has one of the biggest Taiwanese populations outside of Taiwan. So quite a complex mix. And then we've seen over the last 10 years or so, as I say, the doubling of that population. Now, that's a wonderful thing for Australia. Those people here have brought skills, they've brought wit, they've brought talent, they've brought money, they've brought all sorts of things to this community, and they've enriched that community. And it's one of the things that I like very much about living in this country. But that's complicated the relationship for reasons that I'll come on to in a minute. And we've also seen, of course, the growth of the education industry as well. And now we're looking at more than 150,000 students from China in Australia every year, both in schools, in colleges, and of course in universities. But let's look at the change behaviour. So it's no question that China's behaviour, international behaviour, has changed dramatically since the global financial crisis. It's around that time that we see the 9-dash line maps being submitted to the United Nations, for example, and then subsequently we've seen those lines extended into more dashes and then into a hard line. Of course, around the end of 2012, we see the rise of Xi Jinping, and then a lot starts to accelerate in terms of changes within China. We see a campaign to weed out particular intellectual and ideological influences within China. We see growing nationalism. We see later on the term limits shifts, really dramatic change in China's political system, which arguably destabilizes the complex dynamics within the Chinese Communist Party. We see the rolling out of One Belt, One Road that becomes BRI. We see the declaration of an aerial defense identification zone over the East China Sea. We see the island building 2015 starting in the South China Sea. We see what's been going on in Xinjiang over the last few years or so, and the way in which the Uyghur population of those areas has been managed. We see a renewed anti-religious campaign, the tearing down of crosses from churches and so on. In 2017, we see a border dispute with India, which caused a lot of concern across the world. And then latterly, we've seen Hong Kong, we've seen growing bellicosity targeted particularly at Taiwan and so on. Now, and while this has been also going on, we've seen the Chinese Communist Party emphasize more its operations to try and influence opinion overseas. And here, the primary objective is to try and influence the diaspora population, the Chinese diaspora overseas, from businesses to students and so on. We've also seen a particular emphasis on students who in the past would come overseas and they would experience life in different countries and hear lots of different ideas and so on and so forth. We've seen a ramping up of efforts through the embassies and consulates, but also through community organizations and through things like the Chinese Students and Scholars Association to try to ensure that those students are not necessarily exposed to as many ideological influences that might be prejudicial or problematic for the Chinese Communist Party as in the past, and also to ensure that they don't express those opinions or show signs that they might do so if they return to China and therefore cause political problems. So we've seen interference to a degree in universities as well, and an effort to try and influence what goes on and what's taught in universities, not just through Confucius Institutes, but through other things as well. And then, of course, in Australia notoriously too, we've seen attempts to influence politicians in ways that, of course, we cannot possibly do within China. It's not possible for us to fund the Chinese Communist Party. It's not really possible for us to woo local politicians by taking them on nice trips around Sydney Harbour, for example. Those things will be frowned upon, and perhaps rightly, by the Chinese Communist Party. And yet what we've seen in Australia is efforts by Chinese state-owned enterprises to woo ex-ministers onto their boards with large salaries. Everybody knows about Andrew Robb's $800,000 a year for working for Landbridge shortly after he stepped down as a minister in government. And then we saw, of course, the Sam Dastyari affair, in which a very close relationship with a Chinese business person ended up in Dastyari's resignation from the Senate. And in response to all of this, of course, Australia has had to do a number of different things. It hasn't gone as far as I think it probably should in donations reform. It's a really crucial issue there. It's done more, I think, on things like foreign influence registers, and we've seen that come in, where people have to declare their relationships with state-owned enterprises as well as with governments and so on and so forth. And we've seen obviously fights within institutions, and we're seeing right now a fight within an institution just down the road from me in Brisbane over influencing universities, and it'll be very interesting to see how that particular episode concerning Drew Pavlou at Hong Kong supporting local Queenslander plays out over the next few days or so. So where is this all going to go next? I mean, I think that, you know, these sorts of trade wars, I grew up in the UK and I remember these trade wars from the 1980s when the Americans would target Scotch whiskey as punitive tariffs in order to try to get the Europeans to give up on something else or make their wine lake smaller or such and such. These sorts of things have gone on in the past and they'll be weathered and they will cause pain, but they nevertheless, they are things that can be managed, I think. And in the end, I think, you know, my friend Jeff Wilson, who's over there in Perth with you, is correct that China so far has gone nowhere near some of the core issues. So iron ore, for example, is something which China is very dependent on, Australian iron ore, and it hasn't gone anywhere near close to touching that. Instead, what it's doing is targeting particular peripheral industries that might be particularly vulnerable and therefore put pressure on the bureaucracy and the politicians in Canberra. We've also, of course, seen, you know, the wolf warrior diplomacy, the ratcheting up of the rhetoric that we've seen not just from Global Times, where we're kind of familiar with that over the last few years or so, from its editorials and its cartoons, but also from Chinese diplomats too. So we've seen much more assertive statements, not just, but just in the last 24 hours, statements from the embassy in Canberra referring to Australia's efforts on this inquiry over COVID-19 as a joke and so on and so forth. So language that would not be considered to be diplomatic or at least particularly polite has been used in a way that it hasn't been done in the past. So what can we do about all of this? And you asked me to do that. I mean, I think first of all, we've got to recognize that the wolf warrior diplomacy, the trade wars, the undiplomatic language is not necessarily a function of power or strength. It's actually, in lots of ways, a reflection of insecurity of the regime within Beijing, and concern that China itself faces multiple internal problems that could well arrest its economic rise. And we all know about those, the demographics, the environmental issues, but the lack of social security systems, the difficulty of transitioning away from the economic model that it has at present. All of those things all wrap up for a very, what Rory Metcalfe and others have described as a perfect storm of political challenges that the regime is just going to have to confront in the next 5 to 10 years. And they may not weather that storm. They may not come with that. So for us, I think for Australia, we have to sit tight, and we've got to learn to hedge economically as well as to hedge strategically. We need to know that there is a heightened risk in dealing with China as it presently is in its current state. And that's just going to mean that there are greater costs to the kinds of economic activities that we want to engage in, and that it may simply no longer be profitable or sensible to trade in certain kinds of things, or at least we need to come up with ways of managing the risk better than we have done arguably in the past. But I think fundamentally as well, we need to insist on one basic thing, and that's mutual respect. We know that China is a big, powerful country. It's also a great country, and we know about the history, and we know about the cultural things, and so on and so forth. And it is in many ways a wonderful place. But Australia too may only be 25 million people, but it is a sovereign state, and we deserve an element of respect, and probably some less of the attempts to influence and interfere that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years or so. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Ian. That was excellent as well, I must say. That's great. So let me do a sort of try and capture the essence of both presentations and just fire them back to each other, if I may. Admittedly, I'll be a bit of a caricature, but Hong, what about the general position? There's two sort of things that come out of Ian's talk and much of the discussion in Australia at the moment about relations with China. One is that China's much more assertive in its foreign policy, and some would say aggressive in its foreign policy as far as the disputed territorial claims in the South China Sea is concerned. So that's one big issue. And then from the perspective of Australia, as Ian was suggesting, one of the things that gets people very concerned in this country is not just that China is a big and powerful country in a way that it wasn't till pretty recently, but that it's trying to, the argument goes, directly influence the nature and the content of the debate in this country. So what do you think about those two big concerns that are part of the debate and part of the discussion in Australia at the moment? Oh, are you on, Hong? Have you got? You're muted. You're muted. Do you want to unmute yourself? Oh, there you go.
Okay. Okay. So that's for the influence thing. I think actually, as Ian was mentioning about China becoming stronger, and in various ways, China has been commented as behaving in an assertive way. I don't think actually being assertive is being aggressive, in that China does not want to impose its social system, political system, or ideology upon other countries. So that actually, I think whatever China does, other countries can criticize, but China is not imposing its own, ways of thinking on other countries. That is very important. So that I agree that actually mutual respect is very important. That is why in my presentation I was saying that actually when China is being criticized and attacked, then when China tries to defend itself, trying to justify itself, then China is being accused as being a wolf warrior. So I think I seriously don't think this is fair. I think actually in a real world scenario, we have to be looking at the situation in its reality. In other words, I don't think that seriously China is trying to influence Australia or interfere with Australian politics. China is simply, trying to develop in its own way, not actually to be, imposing its own ideology or political system on other countries. I don't think this is actually a true scenario.
Okay, because in Australia there's quite a lot of concern about I think it's the United Work Front, isn't it? It's supposed to be a propaganda arm of the Chinese government. People get quite concerned about its possible influence and the attempt of creating kind of systematic discourse, particularly amongst the student and even the ethnically Chinese diaspora in Australia. You don't think there's much in that?
I think actually the United Front department is being sort of like a demonized organization. It is largely internal because the United Front was actually an organization that was within the party during the civil war in China. So that actually especially anti-Japanese invasion war. So and the so-called United Front is to unite all elements of the society to to combat against the Japanese invasion at the time. So it is by no means to be united, to be fronting, to be shirt fronting other countries. So in some of the narratives in Australia, this organization is being characterized and demonized as someone that is being created to influence, like an espionage organization. But that's, according to my understanding, that's not a true, portrayal of the nature of that. So the yes, I think one of the audience actually was mentioning about how China has been acting in Australia. But I seriously think that actually you can't really point fingers at a single instance in which the Chinese government is actually trying to interfere with Australian politics. There are instances that you can say actually there are some instances in which you can see some Australian, for example, like Sam Desiari, he was actually articulating his ideas about his understanding about South China Sea, but that's not manipulation of the Chinese government. There's no proof of that. So in various ways, we can always see various exaggeration of the role that China, the government is actually doing in Australia. But seriously, I don't think actually this is a true reflection of the reality.
Okay, thanks. Well, let me ask you, Ian, then. One of the concerns that comes across very strongly in Hong's critique of Australian foreign policy is that basically we're a kind of stalking horse for the United States, and that we are so locked into the kind of alliance relationship with the United States and America's attitudes towards China that we act in ways that aren't in our interest, arguably, but are more in the interest of the United States and don't help the conduct of the bilateral relationship between Australia and China. That complicates it and acts to our disadvantage because we're so beholden to the United States, the argument goes. So what do you think about those kinds of arguments here?
Look, I mean, you hear them a lot, and you know, as you know, I work primarily on India. When India does things that China doesn't like, China's official media says that India is acting potentially as a stalking horse for the United States. Now, India isn't a treaty ally of the United States; it's a strategic partner of sorts, but it also values its autonomy very strongly. It's quite a common sort of rhetorical trope in Chinese official language to talk about this notion that a state is really just acting on behalf of Washington, or that in some way or another it's the cat's paw of the United States. Australia has taken some stands, you know, that the United States, of course, hasn't. I mean, Australia took the lead in banning Huawei, for example, from what's it called, the broadband network. So, you know, and that happened way before the Trump administration came in, way before a lot of the concerns were voiced in Washington about Huawei and so on. So, and there are other examples as well where you can point to Australia kind of discussing these issues prior to Washington, and in fact alerting Washington about some of these sorts of things. Now, there's no doubt, of course, they're allies, they're partners, our defense establishments are closely intertwined, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, to some degree or another, there's some coordination that goes on between those two countries on issues of common interest. And on that sounds like, you know, horrible diplomatic language, but there's no really other way of describing that. But I think, the United States does things that aren't necessarily in our national interest. We do things that are not necessarily in the United States' national interest. And I think on this COVID-19 inquiry issue, there's been quite a lot of disagreement between Washington and Canberra that has been really out there in the open. So when the Secretary of State in the United States was talking about the possibility that this came from a lab in Wuhan, Australian official sources jumped on that idea pretty quickly, and that would have upset not just Mike Pompeo, but other elements in the Trump administration. So, you know, there are plenty of indications of our independence in terms of our independent-mindedness, and also our desire to take different stances to the United States.
Given that the Australian attitude towards the inquiry into the origins of the COVID-19 outbreak was broadly in sympathy with the United States position, do you think it was just a bit foolish from a sort of national interest perspective in Australia to get so far ahead of the curve and to take this kind of fairly high profile position, which was in advance of what the Americans were doing, which was almost inevitably going to draw some pretty heavy criticism from China, who would have felt a bit miffed about the whole thing?
I think it's worth noting that the endorsement of the inquiry and a lot of the leadership of the inquiry, other than that initial Australian request for one, came from the Europeans. So it was the European Union that was, closely involved in drafting the resolution that finally China agreed to, and the United States actually wasn't on board until quite late in the piece. Really waited to see what was going on with other actors in there. I think it's reasonable. Australia's not been the only country that's been asking for some answers as to where this came from, but also, more importantly, how it was handled in the early stages and whether or not there were efforts to cover up not the origin of the virus, but the way in which it was manifesting itself and the way in which it was being managed by the health services within China in Wuhan, probably in late 2019, not just in early 2020. And so we weren't the only country that was asking those sorts of things. We can we can ask questions about whether or not it was announced in a way that was desirable, whether or not we could have done more to sign more countries up. But in the end, the right result was achieved, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, China agrees to it only on the proviso that the inquiry happens after the pandemic has subsided. And let's face it, that could be 2, 3, 4 years down the line, not 2, 3, 4 months down the line.
Okay. Now let me bring in some of the audience who've been sending in some questions, and a couple of them directly bear on what we've been discussing up until now. There's one from, I've got two from my colleagues here at UWA, Yu Tao and Ben Riley. And Yu Tao, following on from this discussion about WHO, this is kind of mostly directed to Hong, but you might want to respond to this as well, Ian, when Hong's had a go at this. But Yu's asking about the impact of this WHO investigation now that China is apparently offering at least some support for the idea in principle, even if there's a bit of a debate about how it's actually going to work out in practice. So the question's about how you think that will affect the subsequent discussion of that issue and the way that it plays out. And at the same time, let me just throw this one to you as well, Hong. This is from Ben. He's asking you personally, Hong, whether you've got any kind of disagreements about any of the kind of Chinese government policies, either in this particular issue area, the health problem, or more generally. I mean, is there anything about the foreign policy or domestic policy of the Chinese government recently, the way they've handled a series of crises, that you would disagree with or you think could have been done differently?
Okay, so thank you for all your questions. I see a lot of increasingly longer list of their questions, but thanks for your questions. I think firstly about China to be endorsing the motion, EU motion of the investigations worldwide. I think actually from the very beginning, China is in support of internationally based investigations worldwide, not only investigative of the inculpating, pointing a blaming finger at China, but actually the investigation should be internationally based and also organized and coordinated by an international body like the WHO, so that actually the investigations can be looking into situations not only in China but also in the United States, in some other countries. In other words, especially the worst hit countries such as the United States, what has been going on over there. So it is going to be transparent and impartial rather than pointing a blaming finger at China in the first place. That is actually what China was opposed to in the first place. In other words, China was opposed to a kind of like inculpating, incriminating, almost like kangaroo court, the scenario, in the first place. But definitely, China is supportive of a worldwide, investigations. That is actually the first thing. The second thing is actually, I think actually China is very, I should say, unhappy about Australia's initiative about starting this kind of a one-sided, so-called independent inquiry. I should say it is not just an investigation, but it's an inquiry or inquest of China. And in the first place, China first talks about the inquiry to be, independence from the WHO. So it is all, organized by a number of countries. And mind you that actually this inquest was, organized by, initially, promoted by Australia. So that actually when Australia was lobbying other countries, to be supporting this initiative. I think this is what China is opposed to. So that definitely, I think China is unhappy about Australia's role in it, and whether that will have an impact on the bilateral relations in the future, I'm not sure. But definitely, I think the two sides definitely have this this willingness to make improvements of the bilateral relations, so that actually, if negative, such kind of negativity will be casting some kind of a shadow upon the bilateral relations, that will be really quite regretful. That is one thing. The second thing is about the China's handling of the health issues, public health issues in China. I think actually at the very beginning of the outbreak, there was, because there's a reason that novel coronavirus is called novel, because it is new. So actually nobody knew about the mechanism, how it's spread, how it's, transmits, in its own way. So there was slowness of response. There was human errors happening in Wuhan, in Hubei, and that happened, for a period of time. And immediately, I think once the severity of the situation was actually alerted, the central governments and, as we know, the key figures, leaders of the Hubei and also Wuhan was removed from their post, was replaced, and drastic measures was taken so that actually the situation was quite quickly brought under control. So definitely there are human errors, there is slowness of response. It happens everywhere, in the United States, in Europe, in a number of countries. But once actually, the situation is being properly assessed, then I think actually China actually took very resolute, decisive, and also effective measures that actually has brought the situation into control.
So, just to push this a little bit further, because this is a very important set of issues. So you think that putting aside the way that the call for the inquiry came about, now that it's sort of gained traction and China is apparently supportive of it, you think that it would be a good idea, even if one of the consequences of the investigation was that the handling of the crisis initially was bad, and that it reflects badly on the kind of non-transparent nature of governance in China and the tendency of the center to kind of blame the provinces when it suits them and when it's more systemic fault about the Chinese system generally?
I don't think actually there was a lack of transparency, or there was a deliberate attempt to cover up. There was, as I said, a slowness of response, human errors that delayed proper transmission of the information, but that was definitely not a deliberate attempt to cover up. But it does China no good. It did China no good to cover such a kind of natural disaster, to conceal such a natural disaster. It is like a meteor, like a falling, meteor hitting anywhere in the world. It can hit China, it can hit Australia, it can hit anywhere in the world. So actually, it is simply a natural, occurrence. Then China was the first victim, to be hit by this natural disaster. That is what happened. So there was nothing for China to hide. This was, as we're discussing, there was some deliberate attempt to smear China about it was being released from a particular lab in Wuhan, but that was definitely being refuted by the international community. So that actually, I think actually it was not definitely, So in other words, once China is open for the express its opinions, that actually is open for international based the investigations in China, in America, in the rest of the world. I think actually China will work with the WHO, to conduct the investigations or surveys or reviews at the right timing, in a scientific way.
Okay, thanks, Hong. Ian, a couple of people have drawn attention to the fact about this idea of influence. I mean, people are making the point that the extent of the influence of the United States in Australia, for example, is huge, significant, and uncontroversial in a way that China's influence is simply not. So there's a question about double standards, and there's a question about why we would be quite so enthusiastic about supporting the United States at this particular moment in time, when arguably they're doing more to undermine cooperation and trying to get this kind of collective problem under control and to address it successfully than just about any other country on the planet. They're handling it spectacularly badly. So, I mean, I guess the question is, why are we sort of uncritically supporting their efforts and giving China such a hard time? Might be one way of caricaturing the question, perhaps.
Okay, so I mean, I think on the first issue, let's be clear on one distinction right from the start. So there's a difference between influence and interference. So influence is something that's overt, that's in the open, that's visible, that there's no attempt to hide. And that, obviously, foreign influence is something which all countries kind of aim at. So we try to influence public opinion, not just elites in Indonesia or Malaysia or Singapore or even in China. We also try and do it in the United States. I mean, we held things like the G'day USA events in New York, and we take, you know, Hugh Jackman over there and so on, and we try and kind of, you know, get, not just, this isn't just about tourism, this is also about investment, this is also about goodwill, it's also, there's a whole range of things there as well. So there's influence, and normally it's diplomats, or it's traveling scholars or actors and so on, or it might be the US Studies Centre and the University of Sydney, but it's all on the table. We know where the money's come from, we know how much money there is, and so on and so forth. And then there's interference, which is not overt, and it's not visible, and it's not out there in the light, and it's covert, and it's hidden, and it's using other kinds of means to try to build some kind of relationship with some actors in order to try and sway them one way or the other over to your side. Or it may be even quite nefarious, and it may just be about intimidating particular groups of people. And we've seen that as well here in this country. We've seen efforts to try to intimidate people who might be pro-Tibet, or they might be pro-Hong Kong protests and things like that. We've seen violence and threats of violence and so on. And that covert interference is much more problematic. Now, China's influence through its diplomats, through its companies, through public events, and so on, is not an issue. It's something that we should welcome. It's a real opportunity for dialogue and discussion. Interference is much more problematic. So where we've got community organisations here in Australia being used as proxies by, not really even by the state, but by the Chinese Communist Party, that's problematic. And that might be the United Front Work Department, or it might be other bits and pieces of the party. Where we've got business people that are being, you know, asked to come in and fund politicians, hand over, what was it, an Aldi bag, sorry, we shouldn't really advertise, I know, Mark, but full of cash to a particular treasurer in a political party. I mean, that's pretty problematic, because there's an attempt to deceive here, and I think it's really the interference which has caused the real problems, because it's hidden, and it's actually not what states are supposed to do to other states, not if they're acting in respectful ways. Now, the Americans do that. They've done it in the past. Big states do that kind of stuff. There's a question there as well, saying, well, you know, we should recognise that. Obviously, other countries have interfered horribly in the domestic affairs of other countries across the world. It's something that big countries in the United States have done in the past on multiple occasions. I think on the issue of the United States and the way that it's mishandling what's going on right now, the Trump administration and so on, I don't think we should be under any illusions about the view in Canberra. The view in Canberra is that we would rather that Trump was not the president of the United States. We would rather that things were quite different. Every person in any position of responsibility that I've spoken to in multiple countries across this region have not wanted to see Donald Trump as president. We're very concerned about his election and so on and so forth. That said, if there are things that are in our interests and strong states are willing to support them, then it would be unwise of us to pass up the opportunity to try and further our interests in that way. And in the end, too, you know, there are ties that bind with the United States, and in November there will be an election, and hopefully by the time we get to January there will be a different president, and things will be dramatically different then, because I think we'll see not just a much more competent administration coming in, but also one that is able to manage the China relationship far better. We'll move to not out and out decoupling and all this rhetorical stuff and the trade wars and so on, but something much more like Thomas Wright's called responsible competition. It won't be going back to the past, because we can't, because of the way that China's changed, but it'll be a much more measured approach, I hope, to managing Beijing.
Yeah, but it's not just in America that this decoupling debate is gaining a bit of ground. And I might ask both of you what you think about this, because it's surprising, because from a kind of classical economic standpoint, there's a sort of logic of comparative advantage in China, and Australia ought to be close and mutually beneficial partners in a trade relationship that plays to their relative strengths. So there's a lot that both countries can benefit from including, and it might start with you, Ian. I mean, one might think that this huge number of Chinese students who now study in Australia is actually a great diplomatic asset for Australia, because they'll come to Australia. I think most of them have a pretty good experience here. They get to see how a different kind of country operates and what a different political system looks like. And they go back to China, and you've got to think it's going to have some kind of impact about at least the way they think about Australia, perhaps. So I'm just wondering if you're both concerned about the trajectory of this debate at the moment, where there's a lot more people saying we're too dependent on China, where China's saying we want to diversify our supplies because we can't rely on Australia not to be a sort of critical partner who we in a negative way. So both sides are less enthusiastic perhaps, and maybe they ought to be, all other things being equal, and given the benefits that would seem to accrue to both sides, because Australia is a pretty reliable supplier. I mean, they might be a little bit unpredictable at times diplomatically, but basically it looks like it's, well, let's start with you and see what we think, and then we're going to go to Hong.
Yeah, I think we are at a kind of, we're in a very interesting area, and this is, I'm kind of conscious of the fact that I'm straying into an area in which I'm not an expert, but I think we are still in a very interesting space. I think it's worth noting that a number of states have been looking at just sort of decoupling in some key areas for some time now. You know, for example, for several years now, China has had a Make in China 2025 policy in place, an industry policy that was focused on particular strategic industries, particularly the high-tech industries, and it was trying to create indigenous components and knowledge and intellectual property, and to try and decouple from its dependence on intellectual property and components and so on that were being made in Japan or Korea or Taiwan, the United States, and so on. And that's one of the things, that policy was actually one of the things that really started to cause some concern in Washington, because as we all know, states that are self-reliant or that try to aim for a kind of much more autarkic economic policies, once you lessen that interdependence, you're also lessening the costs of armed conflict. And, you know, we've aimed for a very long period of time in trying to enmesh states into the global markets for goods and services and so on, because we know that that increases the costs of armed conflict, and you know, that kind of old-fashioned Norman Angell type logic that was expressed right at the beginning of the 20th century. But we've got, yes, we have states that are trying to decouple. It's not just the United States. It's not just us. India has just announced a new policy of self-reliance. China is pressing ahead very much with this attempt as well. And it's something that's really deeply worrying, especially when it comes to those major states. Because it's not just about economic efficiency, it's also about them creating the capacity to be able to independently, or it makes it much more easy for them to use armed force with fewer consequences than they might otherwise face.
Okay, Hong?
Okay, so about decoupling, I think actually China is a champion for always champions for the free trade and globalization. I don't think actually China is actually interested in a more, you know, seclusive, you know, way of development, you know, because pressures from the United States about various, for example, like the Huawei, like various issues, and the United States has been, you know, stopping its technological and also economic and trades collaboration with China. So that actually China is definitely trying to get some independence in its technology and also in its manufacturing industry. That is one thing. But on the other hand, actually, definitely China is a champion for the free trade and internationalization. China is not interested in decoupling with any countries, you know, like Belt and Road. It is definitely about, you know, a kind of like global collaboration. And also with Australia in particular, this supply chain is mutually beneficial. You know, China is Australia's biggest trade partner, while also, you know, China benefits a lot from its trade activities with Australia. As you mentioned about students' activities, you know, students, you know, coming to Australia to study, that actually benefits their international outlook, fostering their, very positive understanding of the Australian culture and also the Western way of life. These are all very conducive to their future development, personal development, and career developments. From their experience. So all in all, I think actually decoupling is definitely a kind of like United States invention about trying to block China, to ostracize China from the international technological and economic community. That is actually one thing actually we need to be alert of. About the Australian role in the US strategic policies globally, as Ian was actually also commenting, as you were asking. I think actually that is very important sign that Australia from time to time has been taking some independent initiative to do things. So for example, like a Huawei issue, Australia was actually, the first in the world to impose a total ban, a blanket ban on Huawei, and also try to lobby other countries to bar, the telecommunications into their markets. And also this recent inquiry proposal was also a kind of initiative, Australian initiative. And I think actually Peter Hatcher in the Sydney Morning Herald was actually celebrating the independence and maturity that Australia was actually developing out of this act. I think actually this is one thing that is quite worrying. One thing is actually Australia is acting on the behest from Washington. And well, the deputy sheriff thing, this kind of thing. But once actually now, if Australia is really doing things out of its own initiative, trying to start this kind of anti-China, trying to suppress and deter China, this is actually more worrying than acting on behalf of Washington's behest.
Okay. Now, unfortunately, this has been a fantastic discussion. I must say, I'm grateful to both of you. We're going to run out of time fairly shortly. So let me just ask you both, if I may, as a way of kind of bringing things to a close. Because there's been a couple of questions about the future of the relationship, that's the relationship between Australia and China. So basically, the kind of question is, where do you think the relationship's likely to be in about 4 or 5 years' time, or 5 to 10 years' time? And where do you think it should be? And are those two things likely to be different, do you think? Hong, do you want to have a go first?
So I think actually for the past 3 years, in spite of the repeated demonstration or display of hostility from Australia, China has been appealing to Canberra, to Australia through various, channels, to appeal for improvement of the association of any blame games, finger pointing, and actually really if there are any issues we can always discuss and talk instead of directly making those hostile blame game. That is actually definitely not conducive to the improvements of the relations. I think actually China is very much interested in seeing a kind of improvement of the bilateral relations that is in the interest of not only Australia, but also in the regional and also international prosperity and also peace. So hopefully, actually, we can put aside their differences and come back to senses and stop this blame game. 5 years may be even too long if we hope that actually it can really come back to the right track, to steer the bilateral relations back to the right track, as soon as possible. That is what I hope, and hope that actually can translate into a better understanding of Australia and also of Beijing. Thank you.
Indeed. Thanks, Hong. Ian?
Look, this is incredibly difficult to answer. I think if we look back to 2015 and we look at what China was doing, what China was all about in that kind of early couple of years of Xi Jinping's control of the country, is a very different country to now. And the way in which China's changed over the past 5-year period of time, we often focus on things like the military capabilities or the economic growth rates and so on and so forth. But there's too many imponderables. I think we've got, you could well see a very different China in 5 years' time. I don't think we'll see a particularly different Australia, except in one way. I think we are moving away from this very simplistic understandings of the bilateral relationship. There was always an element of truth to, and I hate to say this, to Tony Abbott's fear and greed comment. There was kind of irrational fear of China, not really understanding the character, just seeing it as being, potentially problematic, and looking at the military rise and so on. And then there was always the greed element too, that this was a great, huge, massive market that was going to make all of us colossally rich, and that was a wonderful thing. That was it was problematic in so many different ways. But we're now moving to a much more complex understanding of the ties that we have between the two. And they are human, they're about the communities, they're about the way in which we involve and interact with Chinese Australians in this community that we've got, of all the different peoples that we have in this country. The way in which we protect people from, not just from intimidation, whether it's from people who are prejudiced or whether it's people who are trying to act from outside. We've got to come to a much more complex and sophisticated understanding, not just of China, but our own interests. I think we're moving in that direction, I have to say. I mean, I think that everybody complains about the nastiness of the debate internally, and that we're all using terms that people are finding very insulting, and there are lots of hurt feelings here, there, and everywhere, not just in China. But I think we're actually making some progress here in learning how to manage what is just going to be difficult.
Anyway, I think, if Mark might say so, I think tonight's discussion has been a modest step in the right direction, hasn't it? Because clearly people have different views, and they kind of reflect our different backgrounds and histories and where we're located in the world. But I think the fact that we can think about and discuss and come to some sort of understanding of each other's positions, at least, is useful and important. And I'm delighted that both of you were able to do it, because I don't think we could have had better people giving us a bit of an insight into both sides of the debate and the kinds of thinking that informs both sides of the debate. So let's hope this could be the start of greater and more significant discussions in the future. So thanks very much, guys. That was fantastic. Really enjoyed it. I hope the audience did as well. And speaking of which, this is the first in what's supposed to be a series. Our next one will be on June the 17th with Professor Amitav Acharya, who I'm sure most of you will have heard of, because he's one of the most famous international relations scholars in the world, I think it's fair to say. And we're going to be talking about stuff that flows from tonight's discussion in some ways, about the evolution of the international order in a kind of post-COVID world, and what that might look like, particularly in the context of some of the ideas that Amitav's developed. But we'll have more information about that on the Public Square website in the next few days. And I look forward to welcoming you all back, including you, Ian and Hong as well, if you'd like to join us, and for another really good discussion. But thanks to you both. You've kicked off this series in a fantastic way, and hopefully some good things will come out of that. And thanks to the audience for all your questions. Sorry I couldn't get to them all, but multi-skilling's never been my strong suit, I'm afraid. So, but it's been great. So, and thanks for everybody for participating, and look forward to welcoming you to the next one in about a month's time. So thanks again, one and all, anyway.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, bye.
Okay.
Bye, Ian.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah.
Yeah, good to be in touch.
Yes, keep in touch. Yeah, bye.
Yeah,
bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.